So we're diving into a galaxy far, far away today.
Okay.
But, and you're going to chuckle when I say this, the controversy we're going to unpack is closer to home than you might think.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we're talking about Sister,
Okay.
a transgender clone trooper,
Okay. Yeah.
and the reaction that she's gotten from the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, it's been I've been fascinated to follow this.
Really?
Yeah, it's for a character that's only appeared in a couple of the novels so far.
Okay.
Queen's Hope and Brotherhood.
Okay.
It's really kind of taken on a life of its own.
And we've got a whole stack of articles and even some Reddit threads here
Okay.
to back all this up.
Sure.
But before we go full-on hyperdrive here, let's set the scene for the listener,
Okay.
who is Sister and what makes her so controversial.
So, Sister is a clone trooper fighting for the Republic in the Clone Wars, just like we saw in the prequel movies. What sets her apart, though, is that she's been identified as a transgender woman.
And her armor, there's something about the armor that's got people talking, right?
Yeah, so some fan artists, and even a few of the official depictions, incorporate the colors of the transgender pride flag,
Okay.
which is the blue, pink, and white.
Right.
And they work those into her armor markings.
Subtle?
It's subtle, but it's definitely a deliberate signal for those who, know what they're looking at.
A little Easter egg.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we have a clone trooper who's part of this historically male-dominated group, and now she's being recognized as transgender.
Mm-hmm.
I can already see how this might be sparking some strong reactions.
Yeah.
What are people saying?
Yeah, so the reactions have really been all over the map. Some fans are celebrating this, they love this inclusion, and then others are very much pushing back.
Okay.
And those that are against it generally fall into two camps. Those who say that this breaks the established lore, the canon of Star Wars,
Okay.
and those who see this as just bad representation, although those two often overlap.
Okay, let's start with the lore argument.
Sure.
What's the reasoning there?
So their main point is that all clones are genetically identical, right? They all stem from Jango Fett's DNA.
Right.
So if one clone is transgender, shouldn't they all be?
That does seem to follow, like, the logic of the whole, clone army concept.
Right, and some fans are even pointing to the what's considered Legends continuity now, which, it's not current canon anymore, but it still holds a lot of weight with a lot of fans.
Right.
And in Legends, the Kaminoans who created the clones were incredibly strict about eliminating any clones that they deemed defective.
Right.
Like even a clone with a slightly different eye color, gone, out. So the argument is that they would never let a clone with gender dysphoria make it through,
But hold on, haven't there already been inconsistencies with the clone genetics in Star Wars?
Oh, yeah.
We have 99, we've got the Bad Batch.
Yeah.
We even have clones running around with different colored eyes.
Oh.
I mean, they're not all perfectly identical, are they?
That's a great point. That's a key point that that a lot of the fans on that side of the argument are bringing up. Even before Sister, the idea that all the clones were 100% uniform, it was always kind of debatable.
Right.
And then let's not forget Omega.
Right.
The female clone from the Bad Batch.
Right.
Her very existence, kind of pokes holes in the idea that they're all these exact copies of Jango Fett with absolutely no variation.
Yeah, so the it breaks canon argument might have some holes in it.
It's a tough one, yeah.
Okay, so what about the bad representation side? What are their concerns?
This is where it gets a little more interesting, I think, because their argument isn't so much about the in-universe logic as it is the intent and the execution of including a transgender character in the first place.
Okay.
Some people accuse Disney, who owns Star Wars now,
Right.
of virtue signaling,
Oh.
basically checking a diversity box without actually having genuine representation.
So they're saying Sister feels more like a token gesture than like a fully developed character.
That's kind of the core of it. Yeah, they argue that so far, at least, Sister's her identity as a trans woman, it's mostly shown through those subtle visual cues, the armor markings
Right.
and her nickname, without really exploring what being transgender means within the context of, the clone army and the Star Wars galaxy as a whole.
Okay, so you've got people debating the science of cloning, the motivations behind, including her.
Mm-hmm.
But this Reddit thread that we have here is getting into some interesting territory.
Okay.
Nature versus nurture.
Oh, wow.
How does that tie into all of this?
Yeah, so it gets to the heart of, like, how much we believe our environment shapes who we are, even for clones, right?
Right.
So let's say, just for argument's sake, that Jango Fett's DNA did have a genetic predisposition for gender dysphoria.
Okay.
Sister was still raised on Camino, which is, an incredibly controlled, regimented environment. Would she even have the language or the understanding of gender identity in that context?
It's not like she's hanging out on Facebook, interacting with
Right, exactly.
other trans individuals.
Right. She's surrounded by, well, mostly identical dudes.
Right.
So it begs the question, how much agency does she really have in defining her own identity within this very, like, rigid structure of the clone army?
Right.
Would her experience be different from a trans person in the wider galaxy who has access to, these different communities, different ideas?
So many different layers to this
Like,
already.
there's lots to unpack.
We're barely scratching the surface.
Oh, yeah.
So we've kind of laid out the main arguments surrounding Sister.
Yeah.
Is there any middle ground in this debate? Or are fans, like, completely divided on this?
Well, I think even the debate itself kind of shines a light on this bigger conversation that's happening in our own world.
Okay.
Which is, how do we portray marginalized identities in media, particularly in these beloved franchises like Star Wars that have these, like, incredibly passionate fan bases and this very established lore.
Right, so it's bigger than just Sister.
Way bigger, yeah.
It's about what she represents.
Right.
And the reactions that she evoked.
Exactly. So for some fans, she's a step towards a more inclusive galaxy far, far away, reflecting the diversity of our own world.
Mm-hmm.
And for others, it feels like a very forced change to a beloved franchise.
Okay.
Motivated more by, this kind of nebulous idea of political correctness than good storytelling.
It's that get woke, go broke argument.
Yeah, exactly.
It gets thrown around so much.
It does, and it's worth pointing out that even among the fans who support, greater inclusivity in Star Wars, there are mixed feelings about how Sister's story has been handled.
Okay.
Some people wish it went deeper, explored her internal experience more, showed more of her interactions with her fellow clones, beyond just the nickname Sister.
So it sounds like a lot of fans, regardless of where they stand on this whole debate, just want more nuance, more showing, and less telling when it comes to her identity.
Totally, and that's fair.
Yeah.
The challenge, of course, is that Sister is, as of right now, a relatively minor character in this, massive, complex universe.
Right.
So it's a balancing act between honoring her identity and allowing her story to kind of unfold organically within the larger narrative.
This reminds me, we have some articles here about the backlash that some actors of color have faced.
Oh, right.
From certain segments of the Star Wars fandom, like Kelly Marie Tran deleting her Instagram posts after The Last Jedi, Moses Ingram facing harassment online after Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Right.
It seems like any attempt to diversify the galaxy far, far away is met with this really, like, toxic pushback sometimes.
Yeah, it's really disheartening to see that pattern. And I
Yeah.
think it speaks to a broader cultural issue that goes way beyond Star Wars. These beloved franchises often become these kind of battlegrounds for these anxieties about representation.
Right.
And who gets to see themselves, reflected in these stories that we cherish.
And this isn't limited to Star Wars, is it?
No, absolutely not.
I mean, pick a comic book, a video game, a fantasy novel.
Right.
Anytime a character appears who isn't a straight, white, cisgender man,
Right.
it seems like this small but very vocal minority just loses their mind.
It's true. It's almost as if, like, the inclusion of even one character who's different somehow threatens this entire fictional world, as if, like, diversity somehow detracts from everyone else's enjoyment.
Which is ironic.
It is.
Because Star Wars is all about, fighting these oppressive empires and celebrating the power of rebellion.
Exactly.
Like, embracing diversity seems like a natural fit for kind of like the core values of the franchise.
You would think. And I think that's kind of what makes the debate around Sisters so significant, because it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves and how we engage with fictional worlds.
Right.
It reminds us that stories about, spaceships and lightsabers can still spark these very real conversations about identity, acceptance, and, who deserves a place in the stories we tell.
So we've covered the main arguments, the backlash, the wider implications. Here's what I'm curious. These articles mention that Sister actually meets Anakin Skywalker in one of the novels, and he's the one who uses the term transgender.
Oh, wow.
in the Star Wars universe.
Okay.
How did that scene play out? What kind of response did it get?
So that scene in particular has been a bit of a lightning rod.
Yeah.
Some readers found it really heartwarming, like a genuine moment of acceptance and understanding from a character who, let's be honest, doesn't always get things right. Others found it very clunky, very contrived, like a forced attempt to insert, real-world terminology into this galaxy far, far away that might have its own way of understanding gender identity.
Right. And I imagine the author knew that this was going to be a sensitive topic.
Yeah.
Did she ever address the controversy directly?
She did, yeah. In a social media post that has since been deleted, Johnston acknowledged that Sister's role in Queen's Hope was intentionally small.
Oh.
She didn't want to use her existence as like a marketing ploy,
Okay.
but rather like a way to introduce a transgender character into the canon and leave the door open for other Star Wars writers to potentially explore her story in more depth later on.
Okay.
She specifically wanted her to interact with Anakin.
Okay.
Because she was aiming for this moment of like innocence and immediate acceptance.
So it sounds like her intention was to create a character, not a controversy, and to kind of pave the way for, more nuanced exploration of this down the line.
Right, exactly. And it's important to remember that Brotherhood, where Sister has a slightly larger role, was written by a different author, Mike Chen.
Right.
So it'll be really interesting to see how or if her story develops in any future canon material.
So a lot of this boils down to potential Sister's existence. It's just the beginning.
Right.
The real question is whether future writers will actually take the opportunity to explore her character with the depth and nuance that she deserves.
Right. And whether the fandom will be open to that exploration.
Right, with open minds and hearts.
Yes, exactly.
Speaking of open minds, this whole discussion brings something else to mind.
What's that?
One of the articles mentions that this new Star Wars book featuring Sister is being marketed to children.
Oh, wow.
That's a bold move.
It is.
Considering the adult fandom is already all in a tizzy.
Right. Yeah, it raises the question, should we shield children from these kinds of stories? Or should we, expose them to diverse characters and experiences from a young age and teach them about acceptance and empathy early on?
It's almost a microcosm of this larger debate, isn't it?
It really is, yeah.
Do we stick with what's familiar, even if it means excluding certain groups? Or do we push boundaries, challenge assumptions, and create a more inclusive world, even if it means risking backlash and discomfort?
It's a choice we face not just in our fictional universes,
It is.
but in our real lives.
It is.
And speaking of facing choices, one of the most interesting things that we came across in our research touched on the science behind Sister's existence.
Oh, tell
So remember how some fans are arguing that, if one clone is transgender, they should all be transgender?
Right, right.
Well, a Reddit user, McGillis, proposed an explanation that might actually reconcile this with the existing canon. They suggested that Jango Fett, and by extension all of his clones, might have a very specific genetic makeup. Male expressing XX chromosomes.
Interesting.
It's rare.
Okay.
But it does happen.
So instead of, breaking these established rules of the Star Wars universe,
right,
this theory finds a way to kind of work within them.
Exactly.
Even if it is a little speculative.
Yeah, and I think it's a real testament to the creativity and the ingenuity that you find within fandom.
Yeah.
Even amidst this, heated debate, there's this desire to, find ways to make the story work, to bridge those gaps between, what might seem like conflicting viewpoints.
That's the beauty of fandom, the passion, the willingness to really engage with these complex issues and to find ways to make the story resonate, even if it gets a little messy sometimes.
Well, it definitely gets messy.
Which, let's face it, it often does.
It really does.
Fandom reflects our own diversity of thought and how we each connect to the stories we love.
Right.
And sometimes those connections spark these debates that reach way beyond, the screen or the page.
Absolutely, yeah. It goes to show that even in a galaxy far, far away, the impact of representation, the power of storytelling to ignite these kinds of conversations, that's something worth paying attention to.
It really is. Okay, so we really dug into the heart of this whole Sister situation.
We really did.
All the arguments, the anxieties, even those fan theories.
Right.
It's clear this goes way beyond this one character.
Way beyond, yeah.
In a galaxy far, far away.
This debate, I think, really shines a light on how we're grappling with these real-world issues, even within these fictional universes.
Yeah.
The science of gender identity, the role of representation, even the ethics of cloning.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. These are all topics that people are having these, really intense, passionate discussions about both inside and outside of fandom.
Right. And as we've seen, there are no easy answers here.
Right.
The science is complicated and it's always evolving,
Yeah.
you know?
Mm.
We're still learning about the interplay of nature and nurture, genetics and environment, all of that when it comes to gender identity.
And that's what makes this so fascinating, Star Wars,
Yeah.
for all the spaceships and the lightsabers. It
Wow.
gives us this really interesting platform to engage with these very real, very complex, and constantly evolving understandings of, like, who we are.
It's a great example of how science fiction can be such a powerful tool, for exploring these complex issues, sparking these conversations, maybe even challenging our own assumptions a little bit.
Totally. It lets us examine these issues from a different angle, ask those what-if questions, and consider perspectives that we might not encounter in our day-to-day lives.
So for our listener who's tuning into this whole debate for the first time,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway here? What's the core message in all of this?
I think the most important thing is to just come to the table with an open mind and a willingness to listen. Recognize that this isn't just about this one character or this one storyline. It's really a microcosm of these, like, larger societal shifts and anxieties that are happening right now. And
Yeah.
whether you agree with how Sister has been included, or even if you don't,
Right.
it's still a really valuable opportunity to just engage in a meaningful discussion about representation, inclusivity, and the role of storytelling in kind of shaping how we see the world.
It's a reminder that the stories we tell, even the ones that take place in a galaxy far, far away, they still have this power to reflect our own complexities, challenge our assumptions, and maybe even, help us envision a more inclusive future.
And sometimes those stories, they spark the most important conversations when they leave us with more questions than answers.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to ponder.
Okay.
If including one character like Sister can generate this much discussion, this much passion even,
Right.
what does that say about the power of representation and the need to make sure that all voices are heard?
It's a big question.
It is.
And it's definitely one worth considering long after this deep dive is over, because ultimately, the stories we choose to tell, the characters we choose to embrace,
It says a lot.
it says a lot about who we are and who we want to be.
Well said.